Hello and welcome to this new installment of Karger in Conversation. I am Francesca Brazzarotto and I thank you all for tuning in today during what has possibly been one of the busiest open access weeks to date, especially for us at Kargers. For those of you who haven't attended before, this series is a quarterly event that brings together experts from the publishing industry, librarians, funders, and researchers worldwide. The main aim is to discuss the latest trends and topics in scholarly publishing from all perspectives. So today we've got a really exciting event lined up for you. We'll be diving into the topic of open access, of course, but with a bit of a twist. We all know how much has been said on this topic, so we're shaking things up a bit with a more interactive format to keep it fresh and interesting. So our four experts today will be asked to break down key terms in open access, exploring how local biases, history, and real-world challenges shape our understanding of the whole movement. Chris Box will be moderating, and we want you to be involved and get involved too. Throughout the session, we'll be asking you at home to vote and share your thoughts. So stay tuned, pay attention, and get ready to jump in. So before we dive in, let me introduce you to our experts. So we start with Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe. A professor and coordinator for research professional development at the University of Illinois. She chairs the ORCID Board of Directors, writes for the Scholarly Kitchen, and she has consulted, presented, and published widely on scholarly communication, publishing, the value of libraries, emerging technologies, inclusion and equity, and much, much more. Welcome, Lisa. We also have Malavika Legge, Program Manager at OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association, supporting its mission through her expertise in editorial development and open access. With a career in STM publishing, she focuses on leveraging technology and collaboration to achieve sustainable open access. Previously, she led open science initiatives as Director of Publishing at the Biochemical Society, and as chair the Society Publishers Coalition. She also writes on equity in open access for OSPA. Welcome, Malavika. For our industry side, we have Andrea Chiarelli, who is the principal consultant at Research Consulting, specializing in open research practices, scholarly communication, academic publishing, and research policy. He has worked the broad range of scholarly communication stakeholders, including publishers, libraries, funders, service providers, and sector organizations. Ciao and welcome, Andrea. And finally, for the publishing side, we have Jeff Lewandowski, is the Director of Publishing at APS. In his role, he focuses on expanding and diversifying the APS publications portfolio, transitioning APS journals to open access, and ensuring they meet the open science needs of the community. Previously, he has led global sales, marketing, and strategic journal launches, always at APS, and also managed journal portfolios at IOP Publishing. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you for being here. Finally, a bit of housekeeping. As usual, we want to ensure that those who couldn't attend today or can only partially attend can watch it later on at their own convenience. So this event will be recorded and made available to you with English subtitles afterwards. Feel free to drop any question you might have in the chat or question box on your screen. I'll monitor them and address them to our panelists at the end if we have time or afterwards, and then we share the answers in a dedicated blog on the Karger website. Lastly, you'll see a screen at the end of the event, and you will also receive an email from us today allowing you to share your feedback. You will be able to advise on future topics that you would like us to cover next time, and also let us know if you would like to be one of our speakers. If there's a topic that you think could be of interest and you could speak on it, just let us know. And now, without further ado, I will leave you with our panel and then our moderator, Karger's Head of Academic and Research Markets, Chris Box. Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks, Fran. Welcome everyone to the conversation today, and yeah, thanks from my side for all of our panelists for joining. You know, as Fran said, it's Open Access Week, so of course we're going to talk about open access, but hopefully take this slightly different angle, and you know, going to explore those key phrases and language that are used to describe the open access landscape, and also, I think, crucially, how they're reflected in reality and perhaps some of the differences that we see there. You know, I think we all know when theory turns into reality, things aren't always as straightforward as you imagine they would be, or as you expect them to be, and so kind of change and compromise and evolution is natural. But that can create confusion and people having different interpretations of what the words originally meant in the first instance. And so, yeah, we've got our panel of experts today who are really going to help us, I think, to explore some of the variation that exists there. So in terms of the format, it's a new format. We haven't tried this, but I think it's going to be interesting. We've got 4, potentially 5 phrases. We'll see how time goes that we're going to look at today. And we've asked each of our panelists to explain, to describe in their experience what each of those phrases mean, but also how they see them in practice. So how it's going to work, we'll go for each phrase around each of the panelists, ask them to describe their interpretation, and then we'll have a discussion as a group after each one, just to see some of those variations and interesting to see how people respond to it. What we'll also do before we move on to the next phrase is we'll do a quick poll, and we're really interested to understand which one resonated most with you. So we'll do that before we move on to the next topic. So that's the format. One last thing before we start, I want to be really fair to our panelists, is that, we've asked them to describe what they see in the language, in the landscape today, not necessarily their individual opinions. And, we know there are lots of strong feelings out in the community there. And so, they're not here to represent the views of their organization or the group which they happen to fall into, but just really what they see in the community. And, as one of our panelists actually used a phrase which I really liked, which was, we're not trying to polarize here at all. We're trying to explore the plurality that exists in the landscape. And I thought that was a nice way of describing it. So we can start with a nice positive approach and an open conversation. All right, so we're going to make a start. Just to give our panelists an understanding of the group, I'm going to launch a quick poll, and if you could tell us which role you fall into, that would be great, and then we will make a start on the topic. I'll give that a quick 30 seconds or so. All right, so it looks like we're around half librarian, quarter publishers, around 13% researchers, and some other clinicians as well. So great, nice to have a really mixed audience, and that will make, I think, for a good conversation. So I will close that poll, and thanks very much for responding. All right, so let's go on to the first topic. So we thought we'd start with a warm-up and go right back to the beginning and start with the phrase open access. So we're going to give each of our panelists a minute to describe what the phrase means and how they see it in reality. And Malavika, I think you're up first, so over to you.
Great, so thanks, Chris. Open access literature, as I see it, includes all digital scholarly outputs that are accessible free of charge online without registration or access barriers, and free of most licensing and reuse restrictions. In other words, the reuse of the open access work is permitted under some type of open access license. So there's 2 parts to it. There's the accessibility part and there's the reusability aspect. And then in practice, we're talking here about books, journals, articles, data, code. All of this can be made available OA. It's a publishing model for those who produce peer-reviewed books and journals, and there are many routes to achieving that, not just a paper publication route, which is the most commonly associated one. But finally, open access is a way for scholarly outputs to have an impact in the world, right? Because by enabling open access, it means your work can be read, can be cited without purchase and without librarians stocking it.
Very good. Great. Thanks, Malavika. So next we have Lisa. So Lisa, over to you.
So I think one of the things that many of us on this call have spent a lot of time thinking about is sort of exactly how sort of formal definitions of open access might be developed, and maybe even have been on task forces and working groups, such as the OSI, which has the how open is it continuum, to sort of treat openness not as a binary status, but as a continuum. So what I'm going to do in my comment is reflect upon what I think everyday language tells us open access means in practice, which means I can get to it to read it without having to go through a paywall. We see typically when people say something isn't open access, what they mean is there's a paywall there. There's sometimes a case where they also mean there's a data wall. In other words, I have to create an account or something. It's still going to be free. There's not going to be a charge, but I'm going to have to establish some sort of data exchange with the provider in order to have access to it. But what I think is really telling is that when we see people complaining in everyday use about something not being open, they don't mean at all that they couldn't reuse it under a CC license. I've never seen somebody say like licensed walled or something, right? I mean, we see paywalled, we see data walled, but ultimately then we really see that in everyday language, open access actually means what some of us would probably in a distincting definition kind of way means public access.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, third is Andrea. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, first of all, I completely agree with Lisa's distinction between the OA ideology and OA in practice. So yeah, in terms of my definition, so open access refers to the principle of making research outputs such as journal articles or long-form outputs freely available online with minimal restrictions on use and reuse. Overall, open access aims to remove barriers to accessing, sharing, and building upon research findings. And the main focus of the OA movement has been on peer-reviewed research literature, but one could extend the principles of open access to great literature as well. For example, reports, conference proceedings, and as Malavika was saying, data, code, and more. Open access is currently achieved through different routes, including various OA colors such as gold, green, and diamond, which sometimes create confusion for authors as well as readers. And I think these are really important point in terms of how institutions and publishers support authors as part of their publishing practices.
Great. Okay, thanks, Andrea. Jeff, on to you finally on this one.
Yeah, thank you. I echo a lot of what my fellow panelists have said already. So I'll draw from my own personal experience. Much of my publishing career has been focused on physics journals. And so I think about the article and I think about what version of the article it is. And in physics, there are practices to make various versions of the article more open at various stages of the research and publishing cycle. But for me, open access is about the version of record. So the version published on the publisher's platform and it's published immediately open, so not behind a paywall, free to read immediately, and generally with some sort of a more liberal reuse license, most often CC BY. We do know that some of our authors prefer other licenses other than CC BY for various reasons. And under that model, when it's paid for by the author, their institution, or their funder, we tend to call that gold open access. When it's paid for by another party, like a set of sponsors, it's diamond open access. But that's how I view open access.
Great. Okay, all right, good. I think that was a good warm-up and lots of consistency there. Any points people wanted to make? I had a couple of questions, but just interested if any points people wanted to build on of others' descriptions before I ask a couple of questions.
Well, I'll just say I'm struck by Jeff's attempt to sort of say that if it's paid for by somebody other than the author, and I guess I'd just like to add, I presume he actually means the author or the author's institution, because I don't think a library paying on behalf of their researchers makes the journal diamond.
Yeah, I tried to say that. Hopefully I didn't mess it up.
That's okay. I was just maybe I missed it because it's early here, but I do think it's important that we distinguish between when there is still some sort of essentially article-based exchange financial versus a different funding model for the journal as sort of the journal level.
And if I could come in, Chris, just to say, I really resonated with lots that everyone has said, but to build on that, or to emphasize rather that confusion that can arise because of labels, right? And I really resonate with that. And already we're seeing that play out with what Jeff said and what Lisa built on it. And partly, I think that's the importance of having conversations such as these, because the labels do cause confusions, right? So it's good to break down what do we actually mean, and how is it playing out in practice. So on we go, I guess.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting with the labels as well, is that particularly if you're into the weeds of the topic, is, you know, we spend a long time talking about CC BY, CC BY NC, etc. And I think perhaps, Lisa, what you captured quite nicely is that primarily for the larger world, if you like, the thing that they most are going to notice, can I access this article or not? And actually the reuse license obviously is an aspect of that, but it's a good example of where potentially we focus too much on those aspects, and that can confuse, I think, the landscape and make it into a topic which then becomes perhaps misses what it intends to do in the first instance. But perhaps couple of other points I just wanted to pick up on. Jeff, you mentioned the word immediate, and you know, I think that is something where, you know, if I think about open access and let's say the policies that were in, I guess, the first half of the last decade, let's say, were less focused on immediate and more over things like embargoes. I think today the intent is much more towards immediate, and you know, just be interested to get the panelists' view on how much immediate is a kind of like absolute requirement to be defined as open access, or whether we should be more open, if you like, to different types of definition for what that might mean. Anyone particularly feel they want to jump in on that one first? I mean, Jeff, you made the point. I mean, or perhaps if you wanted to touch on it, why you particularly wanted to highlight that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's fundamentally about the interplay and the intersection of the various models that have supported, you know, journals and other types of publications and research outputs. You know, with a subscription model or where things are paywalled, you know, the subscriber is paying for value, and they are paying for that value that they need to pay in order to access that. So when you make something open access immediately, it completely undermines the subscription model, right? So it's clearly defined. When you think about, you know, paths through green and things like that, or public access in the US, which for the last decade or so has been, you know, around a 12-month embargo, it's sort of a balance between the two models, right? So there is no financial model for green. So ultimately, it's essentially paid for by subscriptions, and that 12-month embargo allows there to be that value both for the subscriber, and then you have the openness, which is valuable to so many in the community.
Okay, so that's kind of differentiating. Yeah, I think Lisa, maybe you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing I just wanted to add here is that one of the interesting things about the data we have about open access is we actually do not have data that has timestamps in it. So we don't actually know how much open access is immediate, because all of our data sets that we have are, it is open at this moment. It is open at this moment. And so this also results in some very strange oddities in our data sets of things like, there is now, you know, an open access journal in my own field with a diamond model that now says its articles have been diamond OA like back to the 1940s. Well, they weren't. They were subscription print only journal, but in this new era, the journal has opened its whole back file as well. And so those articles appear open, the journal has a diamond model, suddenly we have diamond open access going back to the 1940s. So this is an interesting thing where we say we want now in many policies immediacy, but we don't actually have any way of saying that there is immediacy. And that's kind of an interesting fact to me. I think Jeff's other point, which really is worth drawing on, is that it's the immediacy of the version of record that I think he was arguing for. And, you know, we see, I think, some interesting policy attempts to say, oh, no, it's fine. You can just make the author accepted manuscript available immediately. But then that comes back to saying, okay, but then that's still the subscription model that's supporting that immediacy. And, you know, if subscriptions start to drop because of the immediacy, you know, subscriptions will no longer remain an option, which means that publishing paywall no longer remains an option, which means that everyone is forced into the pay-to-play model of publishing. So there's a lot of pressures in the system that, you know, policies push on, not necessarily always gaming out the full sort of like, then what happens because of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think I suppose in some ways it also, when you think about what the OA transition is trying to achieve, I guess it's a complete transition to open access. It's not necessarily a partial, and I mean, maybe that's the case. Maybe, I think that's a good question actually in some ways to look into. But sometimes I think through in my mind is what would be the goal here, in that, let's say we've got to about 50% of articles are published on an open access basis in 2023. I think the data suggests something like that. And those would be focusing on more those that are made immediately available rather than those that are available over time. So is everything being immediately available the goal, or is some version of it being made available the goal? And that's perhaps some questions to think about. But defining open access in the first instance clearly has some variation, but I can also see some pretty consistent answers from you. I think we know it's primarily about being free to read and also about having that reuse capability, but some definite variations that exist around that. I think Fran putting the question up means that I should be moving on to the next topic actually, since I'm also on the clock here. And so, okay, so great, that was a good warm up. So the next one we're going to move on to, I think this one's a bit more complicated. Oh, Fran's, oh, you want me to launch the poll, don't you? Yeah, I'm going to launch a quick poll then to ask our audience which answer resonated most with you.
Okay, I'm just going to jokingly say I didn't know we were in a competition.
Yeah. I mean, I think this one's a difficult one to answer because there's a lot of consistency between those as well, and so I'm not surprised to see all of them actually resonated in some way with all of you. So yeah, so that's our strongest answer. There we go. 43% are saying all of them, and I guess that makes a lot of sense given the consistency that we had. All right. Okay, so the question 2, yeah, so this one's perhaps a bit more complicated. So we're going to give you an extra 2 minutes for this one. So you've got 3 minutes in total, and it's to talk about transformative agreements and cost neutrality. And first up on this one is Jeff. So Jeff, over to you.
Okay, so for me, transformative agreement, again, I'm going to talk about value like I did in the last discussion. It's really about a transformation of the value for the fees paid, often by a library or an institution or another type of entity that's interested in the content. So, in the traditional subscription world, the library or the customer is paying to access that otherwise paywalled content. So basically paying to read. For me, a transformative agreement transforms the value from read to taking those same fees and paying for the publishing on an open access basis. And again, I'm thinking about the definition I gave of open access before, meaning the version of record, often under a CC BY or other open license. So essentially, it's transforming what those fees are going towards from read to open access publishing. Cost neutrality, I have to be honest, this is one where I don't actually always know what cost neutral means. I spent time, I launched our read and publish program at APS. I've spent a lot of time talking to customers and negotiating these agreements. I understand when someone comes to the table and says, we can't afford to pay anymore. That's a reality. But when I think about the broader open access transition, moving the value proposition to a completely new space, it's not realistic that all customers would continue to pay the same, right? So some customers would have to pay more, some would have to pay less. Some publishers would get paid more, some publishers get paid less. Because we're talking about, in a journal world, how many articles you're publishing, and that becomes the key metric in the new value system. So that's to me is the crux of the most difficult part of the open access transition, and it's why I really struggle with cost neutrality. I don't see how you can have one and also have a full open access transition, because there needs to be that shift. And do I want to say anything more about that? I could go on about this for a long time. Yeah, I guess it's, I'll just emphasize, there are winners and losers anytime there's a value shift like that in a market, and some would have to pay more, and thus they would be, considered the losers in that balance. Some would pay less, and what we've seen is that there are pretty extreme examples of that. So if in a cost neutral situation, some would have a tremendous amount of value for what they used to pay. Some would have a very small or almost no value for what they used to pay. And ultimately that's unfair and unsustainable.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Jeff. Next we have Andrea.
Yes, thank you. So, right, so a transformative agreement is a contractual arrangement, first of all, between academic institutions and publishers. The goal is to transition from the traditional subscription-based model where institutions pay to access scholarly content to an open access model where research is freely accessible to the public as well. The key feature of transformative agreements is that they enable institutions to use a single payment to the publisher to cover the open publication of articles and access to articles. And an important part of transformative agreements is also that authors retain rights and typically assign Creative Commons licenses to their work in most cases, which is in contrast to the subscription model where rights are usually signed off to the publisher. Cost neutrality, as Jeff was saying, is a complex topic, but yeah, in principle, it's the idea that institutions shouldn't face higher costs for shifting from a subscription-based publishing model to an open access model, meaning that the overall spending by an institution on scholarly publishing should remain approximately the same as it was under traditional subscription model while transitioning to an open access model. And yeah, we should acknowledge that this concept is not universally applied in practice. It's very difficult, and institutions can indeed face increasing costs in some cases, as Jeff was saying. Anyway, the overarching goal of transformative agreements is definitely to move towards open publishing by default for all scholarly literature. So transformative agreements are essentially seen as a stepping stone towards this and are meant to help publishers adapt and shift their business model and also their processing and workflows in a way that is affordable and is sustainable in the near term. I would add that currently there isn't really a standard contract that all publishers and libraries agree to. So this landscape can get quite confusing for authors as well as professional services at universities. Universities might deal with some publishers through nationally negotiated contracts. Other contracts are directly negotiated. Others are dealt with through consortia. So there's a lot of diversity in how this works in practice. And unfortunately, this leads to quite a lot of variability in terms of what options are available to researchers in an institution in terms of where they publish. So for example, how many articles are included within each transformative agreement with each different publisher is quite likely to vary. Another potential downside is that transformative agreements, although they aim to increase open access publishing, they have also inadvertently created some new inequalities in the scholarly publishing landscape. So for example, they are primarily negotiated by wealthy institutions, which put institutions in the global south at a disadvantage in many cases. And similar considerations also apply to wealthier and larger publishers, which are better placed than smaller ones to sign transformative agreements with institutions. And this can create all sorts of challenges, for example, barriers to open access publication due to affordability, barriers to career progression because one can publish exactly where they want. And yeah, I can stop here.
Gosh, you're all very good at keeping it to time, I have to say. So great. Lisa, you're next.
Okay, as the person who authored Transformative Agreements, a primer, which has been read almost 100,000 times on the Scholarly Kitchen website, I have a lot of thoughts about transformative agreements. And in fact, just this week, published another piece on what other things transformative agreements could do for us, such as help out with the research integrity crisis. But I really want to, I agree, sort of like these definitional things of what they are. They're a contract. I do want to say that I think there's a lot of question around what is being transformed, and I have always understood that what is being transformed is the library's spend, not the publisher's income. And I think that's a really important point that I'll get to when I talk about cost neutrality. So it's about libraries transitioning and transforming what they expend on and taking subscription dollars and moving them to publishing dollars, and either sort of in a complete switch in that publish and read model where you're only paying for publishing and then reading is just sort of like tossed in, or in a read and publish model where both sides are costed out and then the total is added. So there's a couple things though. So I mean, I don't think that's you know, like a really contested thing of what these things are. I think there's a lot of discussion around transformative agreements, and you know, whether they're going fast enough or the like. But the other way we can think about what's being transformed is outputs, right? From closed to open. And one of the things we have to say is there's a difference between what a transformative agreement can do for a given institution that has that transformative agreement versus what the collective impact of the entire sets of transformative agreements will be. So just, for example, put out a report. They've been very successful at transitioning the UK's output, right, across all those institutions. But guess what? That's not going to be enough to flip the collective system because other people haven't. So let me turn to cost neutrality and the biggest challenge with this. Institutions are seeking cost neutrality at their own level, as Jeff said, but the problem is that's not cost neutrality for the system as a whole. In addition, the cost neutrality argument fails to account for three other things. One is the overall growth in the output of articles. So it's not really reasonable to think that you're going to get the same amount of services, pay the same amount if what you're getting for that money is increasing. So only fair if you're actually no longer publishing any more than you were before. Then you can have cost neutrality on both sides because you've got to control both outputs and inputs. Secondly, it doesn't account for the fact that publishers have other revenue streams like selling individual articles and licensing content. And finally, guess what? There's all these fully OA journals out there that were never under the subscription model, and that's another cost in the system that transformative agreements can't account for.
Yep. Brilliant. Okay, great. And Malavika, we'll come to you last.
Great, thank you. So transformative agreements, as I see them, they're sales deals between publishers and institutional libraries. They are ensuring